Hello. Today we continue our discussion of globalization, focusing on the readings from Ritzer, Globalization, a Basic Text, Chapter 2. So let's start out by recalling our definition of globalization. And remember, there are many definitions of globalization, but this is the one that Ritzer is settling on for an operational definition for his book. He calls it a transplanetary process or set of processes involving increasing liquidity and the growing multi-directional flows of people, objects, places, and information, as well as the structures they encounter and create. And these structures are either barriers or will expedite those global flows. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit more about some controversies, issues, and debates in the globalization literature, and recognize that Chapter 2 is still very much an introduction to the book. So if it seems like there's a lot of material without that much detail, that is in fact intentional. So we'll see what we can do to simplify it a little bit for you today, and then we'll be following up on all of these topics as we proceed through the course. So the first kind of debate is globalization. Is it really a valid concept? Because there are skeptics that argue that in fact it's not. And so to prove or to support that it is a valid concept, we have to know what is unique about the current era of globalization, what makes it different, what warrants this term globalization. So there are kind of two different types of people, and the lingo is a little bit confusing, but let's start by talking about globalist. And globalist, for purposes of this chapter, are people who believe that globalization exists. And they're not concerned whether it's one overarching globalization process or many types of globalization. For them, either way, it's globalization. They especially emphasize the expansion of the global economy with large multinational corporations, or MNC is the abbreviation. And so these multinational corporations, as organizations, business organizations, very large ones, can have more power to travel the globe and disperse goods and services and production about. They also look at the decline of national governance and the increasing power of large international institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF or the UN, which at times basically supersede national power. Now, the skeptics contend that, first of all, globalization as a concept is too vague, and they argue that many of these processes that globalists talk about are simply different areas of social life where different groups of people around the globe deal with each other. So if we're going to call, everything that happens between people in different countries globalization, really for the skeptics, globalization loses any real useful meaning. And they also see the nation as the primary organizer, the primary authority around the globe. They, unlike the globalists, do not see the decline of national power to the extent that there are these large international institutions. They would argue that the nation vis-a-vis these institutions is still much more powerful. They also see globalization as a euphemism for capitalism. When we're talking about economic globalization, basically they would argue that capitalism tends to expand markets. They start in close proximity and they move outward and globally. And so the idea that the expansion of the economy is globalization, again, is kind of a misnomer for them. So two groups of people, one that think there is such a thing as globalization, the other, they do not. If we look at the history of globalization, so let's leave that debate for a moment, because obviously you're in a globalization class. The author is going to make a case for why this concept of globalization is useful, and he settled on a working definition. So to further support that idea, let's talk about how globalization can happen. And biologically, the book points out that some people think it's hardwired, that human beings are sort of programmed with the genes to go about their world looking for opportunities to survive and better their way of life. There's another body of literature that talks about cycles, and I'm going through this quickly. You can read about it in your book, but cycles of increasing globalization and decreasing globalization. So another way to understand it is that there are times when there isn't that much acceleration or increase in people, goods, services, things, information dispersed across the globe, and there are other times when we see great expansion, great acceleration. But it's cyclical, up and down. Similarly, there are different phases. So we're talking about, instead of cycles with expansions and contractions, we can look at large-scale historical epochs. Again, you can read about these in your book, but they basically document the transformation of people from living very locally and not moving very much to traveling the globe, erecting ships and exploring and colonizing and so forth. Also, we can look at different historical events that seem to represent breakthroughs in terms of destroying barriers that kept people and information, goods and services from being traded around the globe, from flowing around the globe. These are all ways that you can look at globalization, and I think in every one of them, over time, what makes the case for globalization, I think what Ritzer would say is that no matter how you look at it, if we're talking about flows of information, people, goods, services, they have over time tended to increase and expand and cover more areas of the globe. And I did not mention earlier, but it's important to mention that skeptics also point out that many of what globalists are calling globalization, many of the examples, may be common in the global north, but there are entire regions in the global south that are excluded. So if globalization isn't truly global, then the skeptics would say it doesn't exist. The globalists would point out that these processes can be uneven and growth is not complete, but that the trend looks to be long-term and will eventually include the entire globe. And they'd also argue that there really aren't very many regions at all, if any, that are untouched by globalization in some form. So Ritzer talks about the last 50 years in terms of broader developments, and this is where I think it gets a little bit easier to understand why we're using this term globalization, because there have been these massive changes in the political economy of the world since World War II that have dramatically accelerated the flow of people and goods and services and information. The first is the emergence of the United States after World War II as a global power. The United States, as you know, the mainland was not affected by the war. There were no bombs dropped on the U.S. mainland. Our factories were ramped up from wartime production, and Europe and Japan were trying to rebuild themselves after being devastated by World War II. And this gave the United States a big advantage in terms of providing resources and loans, having political power, and having the world demand its products. It's at this point in time when multinational corporations began to grow, and like the automobile companies like General Motors and Ford and the big three, Chrysler. And also later on, much later, a region of the world that had not been trading with the West, namely the Soviet Union, began to trade with the West after the Cold War ended and the wall fell, and communism was no longer an ideology that was being pushed. So you had an entire extremely large area of Asia and all of the allies of the former USSR who now could trade. Now, they hadn't been trading with the United States and Europe prior to that time because of sanctions that we placed on trade, and because they isolated themselves. It was a Cold War. So not much in the way of friendly trade going on in those post-World War II decades. So once that opens up, and then of course later, I think I mentioned in the last mini lecture, China, normalizing trade with China in the year 2000. So that's another very big economy that has grown and joined the global economy. And so these things now have resulted in the mass proliferation of global flows in areas, more areas of the globe than ever before, and arguably continues to pervade into more areas. One of the debates about globalization is if it is a homogenizing process, and that means, does it make everything the same? Does it destroy variation? And if you think back to my example of McDonaldization and Ritzer's book McDonaldization, McDonald's was producing a very streamlined recipe for not only food, but for how you make a business. And once you have that model down, you can easily reproduce it in other places. And they started doing that in the United States, and then they went global. And I think that is what we see again and again. If you look at very large cities around the globe, you will find many of the same stores and restaurants that you will find in the United States. And so those who argue that it's a homogenizing process would say that as it grows and as it uses these principles of mass production or McDonaldization, it drives the local businesses and the local culture kind of aside. It pushes it aside, or it overcomes it, it conquers it, use whatever terminology you want. But the argument is that by some that globalization homogenizes pretty much everything, and that the world is becoming increasingly the same. Now, those who argue against that would say that no, in most cases the global mixes with the local. The local is already there, or the national is already there. It mixes with the international or global. And out of that, we do get new cultures, new economic activity, new political activity, new forms of government. We get hybrids is a term that's often used. We get a mixing of the local, the national, and the global, and that creates new forms. So that's all I'm going to say about that for now. But it is a rather large debate, and a good one. And you will spend much more time reading about it in all of the different areas of globalization in future chapters of the Ritzer book. So let's talk about the different kinds of globalization. And Ritzer names 7 or 8. The 4 that I like to focus on when I teach the course are the 4 that I think are most often covered in the literature. The main one is economic, and I think there are many. I think you've read in your book the tendency. It's a fallacy, but many people tend to equate globalization with simply the expansion of the global economy and large multinational corporations, increased flow of goods and services bought and sold and produced and consumed around the globe. Certainly that is the primary type of globalization that you hear about. Another kind is political globalization. And as I said, as the world's become more interdependent and more interlinked, these very large global institutions, IMF, World Bank, UN, and others, all have assumed more power than they used to have, especially following World War II and proceeding to the current era. And so when we look at political globalization, the big debate is whether national sovereignty will continue to exist as it has, or if we will have some sort of global governance where international global institutions will be the most powerful organizing principles. And some say that is happening, but others would point to Brexit and populist nationalist leaders that have been elected in various countries that have sort of reversed, that have sort of defended nationalist priorities and sort of reversed some of the global governance or rebel against it. So that's the debate there that we'll look into as the course proceeds. Cultural globalization, very much the debate there is the homogenization argument. Are we losing our native cultural norms and values and languages and traditions, holidays, music, you name it, as a global pop culture basically subsumes local native cultures? And the fourth type is environmental globalization. And what a week to be talking about environmental globalization, because when it comes to the natural environment, the activity in one country we know is very much related to activities in other countries, because oceans literally flow, right? Air currents literally flow. So when we have climate change, for example, it doesn't matter so much where the emissions are produced in terms of where the effects will be felt. They will be felt everywhere. And I think it's a pretty well-known fact that the United States, produces a very large proportion of global greenhouse gases, but we don't, possess the same proportion of the population. So a small portion of the population in the United States and elsewhere in modern developed countries are producing a lot of emissions, and it's warming the globe, and it is affecting weather. And as we look at Houston this week, there are many oil wells off the coast of Houston. Fossil fuels are a major source of economic activity in that area, but yet when you can read the article in the New York Times about the relationship between weather and global warming, and the consensus is that we don't know that every weather event is due to global warming, but we do know that overall storms are becoming more severe, more rain is falling, and we need to prepare for that. All right, so environmental globalization. Let's talk a little bit about two types of globalization: globalization from above and below. And I think one way to think about this is, if you think about, remember the term global north, which are the affluent, mostly northern countries, and global south, which are the poor, less affluent at least, countries usually located in the south, the continent of Africa, South America, parts of Asia. If you look at globalization from above, the wealthy northern countries have a large amount of political power. And so when they are looking at expanding the economy or putting representatives in big global political institutions, they can do so and will usually have quite a bit more power than the poor countries. Now, in response, there has been a growing movement of globalization from below. And this tends to be, at least on the political left, these are groups that are trying to defend the interest of the poor countries, and they're looking at problems such as global poverty. The fair trade coffee movement is an example of globalization from below. There are many what we call non-governmental organizations. Some of them will make micro loans, for example, small loans to people in poor countries to build like wells or start small businesses. So these are mostly smaller groups and often informal in comparison to the big formal political institutions, global institutions of the global north. Also, we have this kind of justice globalism. Let's talk about justice globalism with regard to globalization from below. So when they have the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, there is also a World Social Forum that was formed in response to advance the interest of equality of opportunity and elimination of poverty, and just that the resources of the world are distributed in a way that is fair and just for all countries not just the large northern ones. On the other hand, we also have a globalization from below that is populist and nationalist. And these would be the folks that I think you saw in Charlottesville when they were protesting the removal of the statues. And they are groups like the KKK or neo-Nazis. And of course, they are against globalization from above because they believe that it does not advance the interest of the nation, can undermine the interest of people within nations in terms of jobs, the economy, and political power they have over where they live. So globalization from above and below. A little bit complicated, but that is your introduction to those terms. And I think it will become more apparent how to distinguish these things as we move forward. So there's another debate about whether ideas, sort of culture, ideas are the cause of the expansion of global flows, or whether it's material factors. The materialist explanation would talk about, the capitalist mode of production, which is basically the type of economy we have, and they would say that, the globalization is basically a result of capitalism working the way it should because it's always trying to expand markets. And so once it sort of runs the course domestically within a country, it's going to go to other countries to look for markets for their consumption of their goods or services, to look for labor markets where they can find workers that are cheaper, and so forth. So that's the materialist side of it. The other side is, people have ideas, they have values, and these are what result in different forms of economic systems, among other things, religion, education, and so forth. And these things should be considered the ideas. They give people information, ideas, and these, the idealist would argue, are more powerful than just simply materialist forces. Now, there is a middle ground, of course, and I think as you listen to all of these debates, they tend to be represented as an either or, sort of polarized, one or the other, and of course, it's complex, so there's usually a middle ground. So I think what Ritzer would point out is there is a way to say, sure, the economy's important for expanding globalization, but as people find out more about other people and the things they're doing, this also can be a stimulus or catalyst for expansion of global processes and flows. The question is globalization inexorable? There are some who would argue that globalization is like a little bit like a snowball, that we're rolling down Mount Everest, and as it rolls down, it picks up more and more snow to the point where it really can't be stopped, and the best that we can do is sort of adapt to it or get out of the way. But others would say, and I think this is a very good time to point this out, that just as quickly as countries can adopt the global, they can also exclude it. And we're seeing this in, again, populist, nationalist regimes that are stopping immigration flows. They're protecting their goods and services by prohibiting the import of cheaper goods and services. They're not participating in international treaties. Trump did not sign on with the Paris Climate Accord. And so these are all examples of national leaderships saying, stop, too much. In fact, we want to reverse some of these flows. So I don't think that globalization is inexorable. And this brings up a very important point. Globalization is a concept, so it's not something we can just drop on our foot like a thing, like a brick. On this point, Ritzer would want us to know that globalization is a set of relationships between people. It is not a thing. So the nature of globalization, the form it takes, the relationships, all of these are in the control of human beings. So human beings get together and make decisions, and the outcome of these decisions are actions that result in processes and relations of globalization. So nothing really is inexorable that is a product of human beings interacting with each other, because human beings, at least in theory, can decide to do something different or not do something else. So let's finish today's lecture talking about equality or inequality, and this is a big one, and we will have several chapters to sort of make a final decision. But market globalist, these are folks, again, business leaders and people in the media and academics who are in favor of the expansion of the global economy. They would say that it creates equality. They would say that when you expand trade, you expand markets. So you're able to sell more goods and services by including other consumers in other countries. You're also able to benefit those countries by purchasing their goods and services. Perhaps some of them are either too expensive to produce yourself or you can't produce them at all. So for market globalists, they would say that it's equality. And Tom Friedman is mentioned in your book. He was a New York Times writer who wrote this very influential book called The World is Flat, and arguing that a number of the changes that we've talked about have removed the barriers to globalization. And so without these barriers, the world becomes very flat in terms of allowing the flows of people, goods, services, and information. And he also said that many of the poorer countries, because these barriers have been removed, they will be able to benefit from globalization and increase their standard of living, their gross national income, etc., and become closer to that of their larger counterparts in the global north. So he would see the global south becoming closer to the global north in terms of many of the indicators of economic and human development. On the other hand, empirically, there's quite a bit of data that shows that since World War II, and especially since the 1980s, the difference between the wealth and income of the richest 20% of the world and the poorest 20% of the world has been widening, consistently widening over the years. And so that's, and many people point out that's a problem. And in fact, many of you are taking this class because you're concerned about that. And we'll have plenty of time to get into that, but I do think that, both within countries and between countries, this gap between the wealthiest and the poorest is widening. But the other thing that globalists will argue is that open markets bring about democracies. And the theory goes something like, once people are included in markets and they're able to maximize their personal gain through their jobs or by starting a business, that they gain political power and leverage that they never had before. And most of the time when this happens historically, they push for democratic forms of governance. The other side of that argument is that there are plenty of sort of non-democratic countries that do quite well participating in the global economy, so that they would say that globalization doesn't always bring about equality or democracy. Okay, so that's it for this chapter 2, an introductory chapter. Let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next week.